Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I apologize for the late upload last week. When I say I was having technical difficulties, I was having technical difficulties. I could not, for the life of me, export that video, but I figured it out. I got it done. Now we're gonna continue to use that one method to export from now on because that was ridiculous. Anyway, women's psychology, as we learned last week, even the thought of a woman wanting independence would put her into an insane asylum. Let's now dive into the woman that influenced the field of women's psychology, fought the truly idiotic theory of periods, and worked with gifted children, Leta Hollingworth. Let's get started. Leta Anna Stetter was born on May 25th, 1886 near Chardon, Nebraska. And I think this is our first time in Nebraska. I think so. I could be wrong. I might be wrong. She was the oldest of 3 children, and her parents were Margaret Eleanor Danley and John George Stetter. Her mother kept a diary of Leta's first year of her life, saying that she smiled on day 2, laughed at 7 weeks, sat up on her own at 21 weeks, and said mama and papa by 7 months. Unfortunately, the happy times dissolved by the time she was 3. Her mother died after giving birth to her youngest sister, Margaret S., in 1890, and her father just peaced out, just left the family, and I don't know why. Because of this, Leta and her sisters had to be raised by her mother's grandparents, Samuel and Mary Danley, on their farm. They lived the life on this farm for the next 10 years. And it's after those 10 years, in 1900, when Leta was 12, that their father just reappears in their lives with a new wife and forces Leta and her sisters to go live with them in Valentine, Nebraska. Now, if this situation wasn't sucky enough, the father was an alcoholic and the children were verbally and emotionally abused by their stepmom. Truly an evil stepmom here. Leta described living with her father and evil stepmom as a fiery furnace. Through all this chaos at home, Leta found refuge in school. It got her out and away from the chaotic household, and she described her childhood education in a one-room schoolhouse as riveting, exciting, individualized learning, and found herself writing poetry. She went to Valentine High School and she excelled. She found a talent and passion for writing, and at 14, she published her first poem in a local newspaper. Her overall wit, humor, and intelligence got her a job at 15 to write weekly columns in the town newspaper called the Valentine Democrat. She graduated high school in 1902 at the age of 15 and got the heck out of her house. She then enrolled at University of Nebraska at Lincoln at 16. Her original field of study was literature and writing because she wanted to become a writer. However, and I really don't get this, a series of short stories she wrote were never published due to the fact that she was female, even though she was the literary editor for the Daily Nebraskan, associate editor for the Sombrero, and assistant editor for the Senior Book. I don't know why she got boobs, so it's not going to be published. I gotta wash my hair. I keep getting whiffs of it and gotta wash this hair. While at college in her sophomore-ish year, she met and would later get engaged to Harry Hollingworth. He was about 24, 25 years old, and Leta was about 18 when they got engaged. Harry had moved to New York because he got an offer for an assistantship from James Cantell at Columbia University and would complete his doctorate in psychology there. Leta stayed in Nebraska to complete her undergraduate studies and would graduate with Phi Beta Kappa honors in 1906. This is an honor society that aims to promote and advocate excellence in liberal arts and science, is the oldest academic honor society in the United States, and is among the most prestigious. Leta also received her Bachelor's of Arts degree along with a state teacher certificate that qualified her to teach English literature and language in any public high school in Nebraska. She got all that at just 19. After graduating, she started her professional teaching career at 2 high schools in Nebraska. Funny enough, the first one she taught at was in DeWitt, Nebraska, which was Harry's hometown, which is, just so you know, hella small. When Lita was teaching here, the population was about 670 people. And as of the 2020 census, there are just 530 people living in this town. Which, you know what, is actually a whole lot more people than when I was doing a kind of like a exchange work thing in France. I was in this small freaking town and a half that was about a couple miles from Normandy Beach, and the town's population was a massive 15 people, or 13. I think 2 people died while I was there. She was an assistant principal there for 1 year, then took a teaching position in the town of McCook, about 3.5 hours west of DeWitt, which I also saw is spelled like this, but you pick. Lita taught here for 2 years and truly flourished, but she missed Harry, who at this time was finishing his doctorate. When he got an assistant professorship at Barnard College, he was able to afford and finally persuaded Lita to move to New York to be with him, and they would marry on December 31st, 1908. When Lita got to New York, she fully intended on continuing her teaching, but found that the city had a really dumb policy stating that married women were not allowed to teach. I don't understand either. So she settled for being a homemaker for about 3 years, but became, I can only assume, painfully bored and frustrated and fell into a bit of a depression. This was hard for her to settle with. Despite her training and talents, she couldn't contribute financially. She tried writing stories but was rejected by publishers. She even tried to go to graduate school at Columbia University but was rejected because of gender discrimination. Now, I did not know this, how I did a bit of a deep dive. This is 1900s. So to me, it made a little bit of sense why Columbia University didn't accept women, because remember, women couldn't even wear pants back then. But get this, Columbia University didn't begin to accept women students to the fall of 1983. To put this into a painful perspective, in that same year of 1983, the Smash Final aired, the album Thriller dropped, Cabbage Patch Dolls were invented, which, and Diet Coke hit the grocery shelves for the first time. At least they caught up when Diet Coke was invented. With all this and kind of what you're all doing right now, Lita started to question the roles of society and the inequality opportunities for women, and it's from this questioning that she started to become interested in sociology. She started going to university libraries and devoured any and all books she could get her hands on to decipher why women were denied access to work and educational opportunities, and got a fire to disprove all the claims of why society suppressed women. Speaking of Diet Coke, in 1911, Harry was offered a position at Coca-Cola to conduct a study on caffeine. How that goes is the Coca-Cola company was facing a lawsuit from the government under the Pure Food and Drug Act, also known as the Dr. Willie's Law. This was passed in 1906 and was the first of a series of major consumer protection laws, and was the predecessor to the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. And we all know what they do. So Coca-Cola approached Harry to conduct an investigation about the psychological effects of caffeine on humans. Harry hired Lita as his research assistant, and from this job, she was able to get enough money to attend the Teachers College Graduate School at Columbia. And in 1913, she got her Master's of Arts degree, plus a Master's Diploma in Education with a specialization in teaching and educational psychology. Now, you gotta keep up with me here, because a lot of stuff happens in like 2 years, and it's kind of all over the place. So I did as best as I could to try and condense all this stuff. I got confused too. After graduating, Lita got a job working for the Clearinghouse for Mentally Defectives in 1914, where she continued her research on women by administering Bennett Intelligence Tests, which is an examination that gauges intelligence through 5 cognitive ability factors: fluid reasoning, which is basically the ability to problem solve; quantitative reasoning, math skills, visual spatial processing, the ability to tell where things are, like your body parts, knowledge, and working memory. All of these are combined and given a score that is reduced to the intelligence quotient, or IQ. She quickly became the top scorer, and in that same year of 1914, she started to publish her findings. One of her early experiments was to challenge the thought that men had more intellectual differences than women, or men were more likely to be intelligently gifted or challenged, while women were more likely to be mediocre. Just keep breathing with me here. Before we move on, you need some background on the countless stupid, baseless ways women were thought to be the inferior sex. Now, I'm sure you can hear the reasonings and you're screaming at it right now. Men build the buildings, hunt the beasts, plow the fields, fight, and start the wars, purely because they have the stamina to do so far more than women do, and women are mediocre. Yeah, we build the buildings, so we're more smart than you. This, we're not going to call it idiotic. We're just going to say mansplaining viewpoint is due to something called the male variability hypothesis. Defenders of this during the mid-20th century argued that men on average showed more variation in intelligence than women. Broadly, what this means is more men than women were expected to be mentally incapable, meaning men could fall on the extreme low end and on the extreme upper end of an intelligence curve. Now, we know today this is actually true. Men do fall more on extreme ends of intelligence scores than women. This, just stick with me, means that on average, more men are classified as gifted, have an IQ of 130 or above, and more men are classified as intellectually disabled, have an IQ of 70 or below. Now, to be very clear here, this does not mean the average Chad is more intelligent than the average Megan. Both men and women have the same average intelligence scores, but overall, a percentage of men do show a greater standard difference of intelligence of extreme highs and lows than the percentage of women. Oh, and guess who came up with this hypothesis? You're wrong, it's Charles Darwin.
It was thought up by Charles Darwin, and it goes something like this.
I love that scene in South Park. Of course, male psychologists use this hypothesis to support their idea that men were naturally more smart than women. Now, Lita was open to any conclusion that was proved with objective facts and data, and if there was significant evidence, she would accept the conclusion that men were smarter than women. What her problem with this hypothesis is, and I think we can all agree to this, was that it was this viewpoint that was used to justify why women were intellectually inferior to men. So with this, Lita had an uphill battle to set the record straight. And she knew this was going to be a battle because these thoughts went as far back as the 1st century. Quote, girls were assumed to be mentally inferior to boys as a sex and to resemble each other closely in intellectual caliber. In illustration of this theory of female homogeneity, we find in a panegyric on Murda dating from the second half of the 1st century, the statement expressed that the gravestones of women must all be alike, and it is enough that all have shown themselves worthy of the same good report. End quote. If you need to go back and pause and read that a few times, it's fine. I had to read that a few times before I understood what the heck she was talking about. Lita took advantage of the opportunities at the clearinghouse and was allowed to gather statistics about the number of women who were committed to these institutions that would support her claim that men were not referred to mental institutions more than women. This may seem a bit weird that to support that women are not intellectually inferior to men is to base it on the amount that are and are not institutionalized, but Lita thought that proving the amount of women that were intellectually disabled was equal to the amount of men, and that would mean that the amount of women who were extremely intelligent was also equal to men. I kind of understand what's coming out of my mouth. She began to dismantle this hypothesis bit by bit by administering the Binet tests. Over the next 2 years, she assessed 1,000 people and found that in the younger age groups, males far outnumbered the females, and in the older group, females outnumbered the males in the Binet tests. From this, Lita made the argument that there are as many, remember this was a medical term back then, retarded females as males. However, more males are recognized because of social concerns, aka the boy can't support the household or themselves when they're older, so they're sent to the clearinghouse when they are young. Compare that to girls, they would be kept in the house to take care of children and help with the chores till they were no longer useful. Then they would be referred to the clearinghouse. With this, Lita proved that social circumstances played a huge role in the recognition of retardation than previously realized. With that, 1/2 of the male variation hypothesis has been debunked. Next, she set out to prove that there are just as many super smart females as super smart males, despite very few females having illustrious careers. This was an entrenched belief that there was God, I'm gonna get mad. This was an entrenched belief that was set firmly by British polymath and originator of the eugenics movement during the Victorian era, Francis Galton, in his 1869 book, Hereditary Genius. For those of you who don't know or need a refresher, because I needed a refresher, eugenics is the study and belief that wants to improve the genetic quality of a human population. Eugenics can be such a hard thing for my brain to wrap around, so if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. In this, Francis ranked men as 1 in 4,000 is intelligent according to the status that they attained, and wanted to show that geniuses can run in families. And he knew this for a fact because of a particular family member, his cousin, Charles Darwin. I kid you not. Francis's belief that men of genius inevitably rise to greatness as a quintessential fact of giftedness. I'm using really big words right now. Now, Lita challenged Francis throughout her career and argued, quote, "Eminence and superior mental ability are not identical. It is undesirable to seek for the cause of sex differences in eminence in ultimate and obscure effect and intellectual differences until we have exhausted as a cause the known, obvious and inescapable fact that women bear and rear the children, and that this has had an inevitable sequel, the occupation of housekeeping, a field where eminence is not possible. A woman of natural Herculean strength does not wash dishes, cook meals, or rear children much more successfully than a woman of ordinary muscle. But a man of natural Herculean strength is free to abandon carpentry and architecture and become a prize fighter or a blacksmith, thus exercising and enhancing his native endowment." End quote. Oh God. My mouth is working hard. She published these findings in 1914, and this paper would be in the American Journal of Sociology. It was called Variability as Related to Sex Differences in Achievement, a Critique. Now, this is gonna make you mad because we hear it all the freaking time. Lita challenged the we know, women know, the idiotic notion that women would, in a nutshell, become out of commission during their menstrual cycles. I know. We're all just gonna breathe here. Everything's fine. She did experiments for 3 months and had 8 participants. 6 women and 2 men that ranged in age from 23 to 45, and decided to use tapping and steadiness tests to assess motor ability as well as mental tests. She would then compare the result she got from these tests to when the women were menstruating and when they were not, and in turn would of course compare these results to the men's. And surprise to literally no women, she found nothing. There was no evidence that the women's performance changed at any point during their menstrual cycle. Quote, "None of them shows a characteristic inefficiency in the traits here tested at menstrual periods, and there is no reason to suppose that they do not constitute a fair though small sample of the world of a normal woman." End quote. She published these findings also in 1914 as a thesis titled Functional Periodicity, an experimental study of the mental and motor abilities of women during menstruation. She ends it with, quote, "Thus, many scientific light can be cast upon the question so widely discussed at present and for several decades past, whether women may at last contribute their best intellectual effort toward human progress, or whether it will be expedited for them to remain in the future as they have remained in the past, the matrix from which proceed the dynamic agents of society." End quote. AKA, we can do it just fine, even though we're bleeding from the inside. I mean, we're in pain the whole time, but that just makes us more badass. During all of this, she became New York City's first civil servant psychologist while she was filling in a post. From here, she went to work part-time at Bellevue Hospital Center, known today as simply Bellevue Hospital, which is one of the largest hospitals in the United States based on the number of beds, and is the oldest public hospital in the United States, having been founded as a 2-story brick building completed and opened in 1736. It is here that she was offered the position of chief at the psychological lab. She went on to study educational psychology under Edward Lee Thorndike. He is known as the father of educational psychology. She would go on to complete her doctoral work at Columbia under Edward while maintaining the job at Clearinghouse, Bellevue, and as a consulting psychologist for the New York Police Department. Because of course she did. Because I'm Leta Hollingworth. Lita received her PhD in 1916, and when she graduated, she had published 9 scientific articles and 1 book. By this point, she's 30, fighting for the women's suffrage movement because that is in full steam at this point, and was one of 5 members of the progressive era group called the Feminist Alliance. After Lita got her PhD, she was promptly offered and accepted a teaching position at Columbia Teachers College, a graduate school and private research university, where she would stay for the rest of her life. Now, though she started teaching, she continued to devote at least 1 day a week to work at Bellevue. And it's there she helped establish the Classification Clinic for Adolescents and the American Association of Clinical Psychologists. Here, she was involved in developing ethical guidelines and promoting universal standards for training for clinical psychology. She was involved in the training of clinical psychologists and was the principal for the School of Exceptional Children at Bellevue. And this brings us to the second thing she is most famously known for. It was during her time at the Clearinghouse while giving the intelligence tests that Lita began to develop an interest in the study of gifted children. Now, what I mean by gifted is a child considered to have an IQ score of 130 and above. It was in the 20th century, it was understandably assumed that these children didn't need a lot of help in school because they could handle themselves. I mean, their IQ is 130 plus. Why do they need help? Well, as you can guess, this wasn't entirely the case, and as a result, these children were left on their own and were largely ignored, while their peers were given more attention, and that in turn developmentally harmed the child. As we know today, just because a child is gifted doesn't mean that they should receive less attention from their teachers. School is a place for childhood development, both cognitively and socially. So if basically ignored, gifted children, just like any other child, won't be able to reach their full potential. Lita began her work with the gifted, a term she coined in 1916 when one day in a class she was teaching on the psychology of subnormal children, she administered an intelligence test to an upper class student to show the differences between bright and retarded children. This child scored 187, and from this she grew a passionate concern for the highly gifted, and she would follow this child, child E, for the rest of her career. Lita was a strong advocate for the early identification of gifted children and emphasized the most critical point of a gifted life was in the first 12 years and claimed that children above 140 IQ wasted half their time in school, while children above 107 waste particularly all of their time. Now, this is very revealing, given the fact that during this era, the bright children were typically advanced 1 to 2 years in school. Now, before we continue, we need to talk about Madison Terman. He was an academic, an advocate for eugenics, and a psychologist, who around the same time Lita started her work, Madison was doing research that demonstrated in childhood there are equal numbers of gifted boys and girls. He found that from the Binet tests, girls scored 2 to 3 points higher than boys in all age groups up to the age of 14. The highest score he got were girls with an IQ of above 190. This brought up a unique thought. If during childhood girls are equal or smarter than males in their abilities, then that must be the underrepresentation of women in the esteemed had to be attributed to environmental rather than inherent factors. AKA, women can't be smart, it has to be inherited. That's science, bro. This is what separated Madison from Lita. Though the two never met, even though they were working around the same time, had overlapping views, and disagreed on a pretty big point, they had great respect for the other. This is the point they disagreed on. Madison believed that intelligence was inherited and was interested in the study, description, and definition of the gifted, whereas Lita acknowledged the role inheritance played, but also believed that the environment and education had an effect on the gifted's potential, and sought to determine how to properly educate and nurture a gifted child. She noted that most of the established men came from well-off families, and if they had sisters that shared the same inherited smarts, they were not given the education and environment to develop their abilities. And pointed out that equal opportunities in society for women to better their inherited intellectual strengths were not provided. In her work on the intelligence of women and administering the Binet tests, she got this new challenge of gifted children. No problem. She learned that working with children labeled mentally defective, many of whom had normal intelligence but suffered from adjustment problems during adolescence, so she began to focus on this population more. It wasn't until 1922 that she began her experiments. She had a group of 50 7 to 9-year-olds, absolutely no, with IQs over 155. This served two purposes. One was to understand the children's psychological makeup, physical, social, temperamental traits, and family backgrounds, and two, to create a curriculum for them to benefit from. She got these 50 kids from two special opportunity classes at Public School 165, which is modern day PS 165 Robert E. Simon. She followed these students for the next 15 years and offered guidance, even financial assistance, so these kids could continue their studies. She would even go on to introduce and teach a biography class at PS 165 and later at neighboring Spire School. She published several books on these findings: Psychology of Special Disability in Spelling in 1918, The Psychology of Subnormal Children in 1920, Special Talent and Defects in 1923, and The Psychology of the Adolescents in 1928. The last two became a leading textbook for the next 2 decades. Lita was dearly loved by her students and the gifted children, and though she was a devout scientific researcher, she always saw subjects as individual people and devoted her life to helping them. From her studies of the gifted children, she concluded a certain level of intelligence is optimal in school and society, and that the IQ ranges of 130 to 150, quote, comprehends more clearly but not too much more clearly, and created a curriculum that emphasizes on independent study, teaching basic fundamentals, biographical studies, and creativity. These have become the backbone of the modern-day curriculum for the gifted. All of these findings she published in her still referenced to this day book, Gifted Children, in 1926. She goes on to say about the specific problems facing gifted women, quote, stated briefly, the woman question is how to reproduce the species and at the same time to work and realize work's full reward in accordance with individual ability. For the discontent with and resentment against women's work have originated chiefly among women exceptionally well endowed with intellect. End quote. She would do another experiment with gifted children at Spire School in 1936. These children were having educational problems, and though these children were similar to the first group, this time she had to pay special attention to the group's racial mix. Now known as Speyer Legacy School, it got a lot of public attention and was even called Leta Hollingworth's School for Bright Children. During this experiment, she found that children want to explore the world around them, so she created a curriculum that consisted of learning things like clothing, food, transportation, shelter, tools, communication, and timekeeping, and the kids would work in units. This proved to be greatly beneficial to the gifted children rather than, and I cannot believe this was a thing, introducing them to advanced subjects that they would encounter in like middle and high school in today's terms. You can't introduce a 4-year-old to calculus. Now, though these experiments were greatly welcomed and got attention, not all of it was good. Some saw Lita's efforts to help these gifted children with an education as undemocratic. Don't know how that works. In 1921, about 5 years after getting her PhD, due to her study on gifted children, she was listed in American Men of Science, which is a biographical directory that gives insight to the lives and careers of the most influential scientists of the time. And Lita was one of only 14 women listed in Robert Watson's Eminent Contributors to Psychology. This was a list of 538 people that lived between 1600 to 1967 that made contributions to psychology. After this study, Lita began another study, and this time she studied children with IQs over 180. This was another long-lasting study of 12, and this was a more extensive study of the child she assessed in 1916 with the child that scored an IQ of 187. Now, Lita knew she would not live past the children's adulthood, so she built a framework to continue the research. Lita said about the children, quote, who tested above 180 IQ-SB are characterized by a strong desire for personal privacy. They seldom volunteer information about themselves. They do not like to have attention being called to their families and homes. End quote. The result of this study suggested that many very gifted children suffered from adjusting from 2 factors. 1, bad treatment by adults, and 2, lack of intellectual stimulation from adults. She also disproved the myth that gifted children were eccentric, clumsy, and fragile. Lita published over 30 studies of the gifted and pioneered the research and development in a realistic setting. She was the first to write an in-depth book on gifted children and was the first to teach a college course about them. She was also the first to study children with IQs above 180 and developed child-centered therapy, known today as child-centered play therapy, or CCPT, and is designed for kids from 3 to 10 who are experiencing emotional, behavioral, social, and relational disorders and create an environment for them to grow. She would train Carl Rogers, who would become one of the founders of humanistic psychology and would become known for his person-centered psychotherapy and is considered one of the founding fathers of psychotherapy research. Though Lita had a strong position on the importance of environmental and educational factors for children's intellectual development, she did have a complicated involvement with the beliefs in eugenics and practices that spread throughout American science, society, and even branches of feminism in the 1920s and 30s, but her contributions to eugenics in American education were vital to the foundation and spreading of gifted and talented programs for gifted children. She was the founder and lifelong member of the Heterodoxy Club in 1912 that was established by Lita and 24 other highly educated women and boasted some of the early 1900s most influential female intellectuals and activists. These women included Rose Pastor Stokes, Crystal Eastman, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Mary Ware Dennett, Henrietta Rodman, and Inez Milholland. Leta Stetter Hollingworth died on November 27, 1939 at Columbia University Medical Center in Manhattan of abdominal cancer at the age of only 53. Her death shocked many because it was later found out that she hid her cancer diagnosis from everyone, even from her husband. After her death, many professionals spoke out about the astounding legacy she left behind. Notably, from the Teachers College Record, honored Lita for devoting research on gifted children. Her husband would not let her last research findings go to waste, so in 1942, he published Lita's work titled Children Above 180 IQ. In 1976, the High IQ Society, that is called Intertel, made an annual award and named it in Lita's honor for excellence in research in education and psychology of the gifted. She was asked a question about how she became known as a woman of achievement. She said, quote, "I don't know. I was intellectually curious. I worked hard, was honest except for those minor chicaneries which are occasionally necessary when authority is stupid, disliked waste, and was never afraid to undertake an experiment or to change my mind. My family motto translated from Latin reads, I love to test. Perhaps that is the explanation." There you go. Now you know who we can very much so thank, who disproved that women become out of commission on our periods. And you also just know a trailblazer in women's psychology. And I can't help but think I couldn't get an exact connect the dots answer, but I cannot help but think that her work was also the predecessor to classes like special ed and at least the knowledge of how children's psychology works. So when it comes to autism, we know how to better handle that psychology of children. I cannot help but think that. Nobody gave me a straight answer, but if you guys think that, please let me know in the comments. If you learned something today, and I hope that you did, especially that women are completely fine working when we're on our periods, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And while you're down there, please leave a friendly comment. I will be back next week with another video. Next week is Black History Month, so we're gonna do women in Black history. It's gonna be fun. We'll see you next week, and until then, don't be well behaved. You just might make herstory. See you next time, guys.